Why you feel connected to myths you've never heard before you're reading a story from a culture you've never encountered. The names are unfamiliar, the setting is foreign, the customs are strange, and yet something stirs inside you. A recognition you can't explain. The hero's journey mirrors something you've lived. The monster they face looks like your own fears. The sacrifice they make echoes a choice you've struggled with. How is this possible? How can a myth from ancient Mesopotamia speak directly to your modern heartbreak? How does a Japanese folktale about transformation capture exactly what you're going through, even though you've never set foot in Japan? Why does a creation story from the Aboriginal Dreamtime feel more true to your experience than anything you learned in school? Here's what's even stranger. The first time you encounter these myths, they don't feel new. They feel like remembering. Like you've always known this story, but forgot it somewhere along the way. Like the myth isn't teaching you something external. It's revealing something that was already inside you, waiting to be recognized. This isn't coincidence. It isn't even just about universal human experiences, though that's part of it. What you're touching when you feel this recognition is something far more profound. You're making contact with what Jung called the collective unconscious, an inheritance of images, patterns, and stories that exist before you were born, before your culture formed, before language itself. Today, we're going to explore why myths you've never heard before feel like coming home. And in understanding this, you'll discover something extraordinary about the architecture of your own psyche. Let me tell you about Sarah. She grew up in suburban America, far removed from any strong cultural mythology. She was raised secular, educated in science, taught to be rational. At 32, going through a difficult divorce, she picked up a book of Polynesian myths at a used bookstore. She couldn't even tell you why. The cover caught her eye. The first story she read was about Maui, the trickster demigod, who must descend into the underworld to retrieve something precious that was stolen from the upper world. The journey requires him to sacrifice his old identity, to be broken down and reformed. When he emerges, he's no longer the cocky trickster he was before. He's something more complete. Sarah sat in that bookstore and wept. She couldn't explain it to anyone without sounding absurd. A Hawaiian myth made you cry. Her friends would ask, confused, but it wasn't just emotion, it was recognition. That story was her asterisk story. The underworld was her depression. The stolen treasure was the part of herself she'd abandoned to maintain her marriage. The transformation was what she was terrified of, but knew she needed. She had never heard this myth before. She had no Polynesian heritage, yet it spoke to her with more clarity than any therapy session, any self-help book, any well-meaning advice from friends. This happens more than you might think. A man struggling with his masculinity finds himself haunted by the Norse myth of Odin sacrificing his eye for wisdom. A woman wrestling with becoming a mother discovers the Greek story of Demeter and Persephone and feels understood for the first time. A teenager fighting depression stumbles upon the Japanese tale of Izanagi's descent to retrieve his dead wife and recognizes their own journey. The rational mind wants to dismiss this. You're just projecting, it says. You're reading your own experiences into these stories. And there's some truth to that. We do bring ourselves to every story we encounter, but that explanation is too simple. It doesn't account for the specificity of the resonance. It doesn't explain why certain myths grip you while others, equally dramatic and old, leave you cold. It doesn't explain why the same archetypal stories appear independently across cultures that never had contact with each other. The flood myth exists in Mesopotamia, in the Americas, in Aboriginal Australia, in Norse tradition. The hero's descent to the underworld appears in Greek, Egyptian, Mayan, Celtic, and countless other mythologies. The divine child, the wise old man, the great mother, these figures recur with remarkable consistency across human culture. Carl Jung noticed this pattern and asked a question that changed psychology forever. What if these myths aren't just cultural artifacts? What if they're expressions of something deeper structures in the human psyche itself? Most of us move through life assuming our thoughts, feelings, and experiences are uniquely our own. We believe we're individuals, separate and distinct, creating ourselves from scratch. We think the contents of our mind come from our personal history, our childhood, our culture, our education, our experiences. But what if that's not the whole picture? What if beneath your personal unconscious, the repository of your forgotten memories and repressed experiences, there's something else? A deeper layer, a collective layer, images and patterns that don't come from your life, but from the collective experience of humanity itself. This is difficult to accept in our modern world. We've been taught to be rational, skeptical, individualistic. We trust science and data. We're suspicious of anything that sounds mystical or unverifiable. The idea that you might share psychological structures with people who lived 5,000 years ago, in places you've never been, feels like magical thinking. But then you encounter that myth, and something in you knows not intellectually, deeper than that. The recognition bypasses your rational mind entirely. It speaks directly to something ancient inside you, something that was waiting for this particular story to articulate what it already understood. This is the mystery we're going to explore, not just why myths resonate, but what this resonance reveals about the nature of your psyche, about the layers of consciousness you carry, about the images and patterns that shape your life in ways you've never recognized. Because here's what makes this truly fascinating. If these myths live in you before you encounter them, what else is in there? What other images, patterns, and possibilities exist in the depths of your psyche, waiting to be discovered? And what happens when you begin to dialogue with these deeper layers consciously? The conventional explanation says you relate to myths because of universal human experiences. We all know love and loss, fear and courage, death and rebirth. Of course, myths about these things resonate. But this explanation, while true, doesn't go far enough. It doesn't account for the uncanny specificity. The feeling that this particular myth, with these particular images, captures something about your inner life that you couldn't articulate yourself. Jung suggested something more radical, that myths are the language of the collective unconscious. They're how the deeper layers of the psyche communicate. When you resonate with a myth, you're not just recognizing similar experiences. You're making contact with archetypal structures that organize experience itself. This changes everything, because if it's true, then myths aren't just entertaining stories or cultural artifacts. They're maps, keys, doorways into the deeper dimensions of your own psyche. And learning to read them, to understand why they affect you, is learning to understand yourself at levels you didn't know existed. Jung's discovery of the collective unconscious came from a crisis in his own life. After his break with Freud, he went through what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period where he deliberately explored the depths of his own psyche through a practice named active imagination. During this time, he encountered images, figures, and stories that he'd never consciously learned. Ancient symbols appeared to him, mythological figures spoke to him, patterns emerged that he later found in myths and religious texts from cultures he'd never studied. This wasn't psychosis. Jung maintained his functioning throughout, but it was a descent into layers of mind that conventional psychology didn't acknowledge. What Jung discovered was that the psyche has structure beyond personal experience. Yes, there's the ego, your conscious sense of I. Yes, there's the personal unconscious, your forgotten memories, repressed experiences, the contents of your life that fell out of awareness. But beneath that, Jung proposed, lies the collective unconscious, a shared substrate of human psychological life. The collective unconscious isn't a place. It's not some mystical realm where all minds connect. Think of it instead as inherited psychological structures like the instincts, but operating at the level of image and pattern rather than behavior. Just as you're born with the capacity to learn language, to recognize faces, to respond to certain stimuli, you're also born with archetypal patterns that shape how you organize experience. Jung called these patterns archetypes, not archetypes as we casually use the term today, not just types of characters or personalities, but fundamental organizing principles in the psyche. Archetypes are like psychological organs. You can't see them directly, but you can see their effects. You can see them in myths, dreams, fantasies, and in the patterns that appear across human culture. The mother archetype, for instance, isn't your personal mother or any specific mother. It's the pattern of mother-ness itself, the psychological structure that organizes experiences of nurturing, dependency, nourishment, and return. This archetype expresses itself differently across cultures, as Demeter, as Kali, as the Virgin Mary, as Pachamama. But the underlying pattern is the same. The hero archetype organizes experiences of facing challenges, overcoming obstacles, transformation through ordeal. The wise old man or woman archetype carries the pattern of guidance, knowledge, initiation. The shadow archetype contains what you've rejected, repressed, denied about yourself, but also your unrealized potential, your creative depths, everything you haven't yet integrated. These aren't just interesting, theoretical concepts. They're living realities in your psyche right now. They're active. They're influencing your perceptions, your emotions, your choices. When you fall instantly in love, the lover archetype is activated, and you project its pattern onto another person. When you're drawn to mentor or guide someone, the wise elder archetype is constellating in you. When you're compelled to embark on some difficult journey of change, the hero archetype is stirring. Here's where this connects to myth. Myths are the collective expression of archetypal patterns. They're humanity's way of giving form to these invisible structures. When an ancient storyteller shaped a tale about a hero descending to the underworld, they weren't inventing something arbitrary. They were giving voice to an archetypal pattern that lives in all human psyches, the pattern of psychological death and rebirth, of confronting what's been rejected, of integrating what was lost. This is why myths from different cultures, created by people with no contact with each other, tell remarkably similar stories. Not because of cultural diffusion, though that happens, but because they're all drawing from the same source, the collective unconscious with its shared archetypal patterns. And this is why you can encounter a myth for the first time and feel like you've always known it. You have always known it, just not consciously. The archetypal pattern the myth expresses already lives in you. The myth is giving form and image to something that was previously formless and unconscious in your psyche. Jung understood that this isn't just abstract theory. It has profound practical implications. When you resonate deeply with a myth, it's often because that particular archetypal pattern is trying to become conscious in you. Your psyche is attempting to communicate something to your ego, consciousness, and the myth provides the language. Let's return to Sarah and the Maui story. Why that myth, at that moment, in Jungian terms, she was undergoing what he called the individuation process, the psyche's inherent drive toward wholeness. Her marriage had required her to live through her persona, the social mask, the acceptable version of herself. Parts of her authentic self had to be suppressed, denied, pushed into shadow. The divorce was initiating a psychological death of that false self. But like all initiations, it required a descent facing what had been lost, reclaiming what had been abandoned, integrating what had been split off. The Maui myth gave form to this archetypal process. It showed her the pattern she was living through. It revealed that what felt like personal crisis was actually an archetypal journey, one that countless humans before her had traversed. This is one of the most profound aspects of Jung's understanding. You are never alone in your psychological struggles. Whatever you're experiencing, however unique it feels, is patterned on archetypal structures that humanity has been navigating for millennia. The myths are proof of this. They're testimony that others have walked this path before. But here's what's crucial. The archetypes aren't just patterns you observe. They're forces you engage with. They have their own intelligence, their own purposes. Jung described them as autonomous. They act in the psyche with their own agency. This is why you can't just think your way through a psychological crisis. The archetypes must be lived experienced, integrated. When the hero archetype activates in you, you're called to an actual journey. When the shadow demands integration, you must actually face what you've rejected. When the self, Jung's term for the center and totality of the psyche, begins its work of individuation, your entire life reorganizes around this deeper purpose. Myths teach you how to do this. They're instruction manuals written in the language of image and symbol. They show you what the journey requires. The hero myth tells you, you must leave the familiar world, face trials, descend to the depths, retrieve the treasure, and return transformed. The death and rebirth myth tells you, the old self must die, there will be a period in the underworld, emergence is possible, but you will not be who you were. This is why myths you've never heard before can speak to you with such immediacy. They're describing processes your psyche already knows. They're articulating journeys you're already on, whether you realize it or not. The recognition you feel isn't projection. It's the ego recognizing what the unconscious already understands. Jung called this process synchronicity. When it happens, meaningful coincidence. You pick up that book of myths exactly when you need it. You stumble upon that story precisely when its pattern matches what you're experiencing. The psyche, Jung believed, isn't confined to your skull. It participates in a larger order, and a causal connecting principle that brings together inner and outer in meaningful ways. Whether you accept Jung's more mystical ideas or not, the practical reality remains. Myths work. They illuminate. They guide. They heal. Not because they're teaching you new information, but because they're awakening knowledge that was already in you, waiting in the depths of the collective unconscious for the right moment to emerge. The implications of this extend far beyond psychology into fundamental questions about the nature of human existence. If the collective unconscious is real, if we carry inherited psychological structures, then what does this mean for our understanding of individuality, of knowledge, of what it means to be human? Plato's theory of forms anticipated something like this 24 centuries ago. He proposed that beyond the physical world exists a realm of perfect forms, the ideal versions of things that particular instances imperfectly reflect. A specific tree is an imperfect manifestation of the form of tree. An act of courage reflects the form of courage itself. Jung's archetypes function similarly. though psychologically rather than metaphysically. The archetypal mother isn't a perfect form in some heavenly realm. It's a psychological structure inherited through human evolution. But like Plato's forms, archetypes are more real, more fundamental than their particular manifestations. Your personal mother is one expression, the archetypal mother is the pattern itself. This raises a profound question. Is knowledge discovered or remembered? When you encounter a myth and feel that shock of recognition, are you learning something new or remembering something you already knew? Plato argued that all learning is remembering, that the soul knew eternal truths before birth and education, is the process of recollection. Jung would say both. You're discovering the conscious articulation of patterns that were unconsciously present all along. The myth makes visible what was invisible. It brings to light what was in darkness. This is why genuine learning always feels like recognition, because you're not acquiring something foreign. You're integrating something that was already yours. Nietzsche understood this from another angle. His concept of the eternal returned the idea that you might live the same life infinitely, was partly about recognizing the archetypal patterns that repeat in human existence. The eternal return isn't literal reincarnation. It's the recognition that the same fundamental patterns, conflicts, and transformations recur throughout history and within each life. When Nietzsche writes about the death of God, he's describing a collective psychological shift, the withdrawal of projection from religious archetypes. The question becomes, where do these archetypal energies go when they're no longer carried by traditional religious containers? Jung's answer, they don't disappear. They must find new expressions, new containers. When we stop seeing gods in heaven, we start seeing them in political movements, celebrities, ideologies, or we suffer from their unrecognized presence in neurosis and meaninglessness. This connects to Kierkegaard's understanding of despair as a sickness of the self. Kierkegaard identified several forms of despair, but the deepest is the despair of not being willing to be yourself, of wanting to be rid of oneself. In Jungian terms, this is the refusal of individuation, the resistance to becoming who you actually are. Myths address this existential despair by showing you that your struggles aren't meaningless, they're archetypal. The anxiety you feel isn't just personal neurosis. It's the human condition meeting the call to transformation. The darkness you're facing isn't proof of your failure. It's the underworld that every hero must traverse. Eastern philosophy offers complementary insights. The Buddhist concept of interdependent origination, that all phenomena arise together in relationship, resonates with Jung's collective unconscious. You're not a separate, isolated ego creating yourself. You emerge from and remain embedded in larger patterns, collective structures, inherited forms. The Hindu teaching of the Atman, the true self, mirrors Jung's concept of the self, capital S, the archetype of wholeness that orchestrates individuation. The goal isn't to strengthen the ego, but to realize the self, to recognize that your deepest identity transcends your personal history and connects you to something universal. Taoism's teaching about the Tao that cannot be named parallels the ineffability of the collective unconscious. The deeper layers of psyche can't be captured in concepts or language. They can only be expressed in images, symbols, myths, forms that point toward what can't be directly said. Here's what this philosophical exploration reveals. The recognition you feel when encountering myths isn't trivial. It's pointing towards something fundamental about consciousness itself. You are simultaneously individual and collective, unique and universal, novel and ancient. The modern Western world, struggles with this paradox. We want to be individuals separate, autonomous, self-created. The idea that we carry inherited psychological structures, that ancient patterns operate in us, that we're connected to humanity across time and space, this threatens our sense of independence. But perhaps this independence is partly illusion. Perhaps the ego's sense of being totally separate is itself a necessary fiction, useful but not ultimately true. Myths remind you of a deeper belonging. They show you that your individual life is a unique expression of universal patterns, that your personal struggles are variations on eternal themes. This doesn't diminish your uniqueness, it contextualizes it. You're not interchangeable with others. Your particular expression of archetypal patterns is yours alone, but you're also not adrift in meaninglessness. Your life participates in something larger, something that has coherence and purpose even when you can't see it. The philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote about authenticity being true to your ownmost possibilities rather than living according to the they, the anonymous collective. Jung's individuation process is a psychological path to this authentic existence. By integrating the unconscious, by dialoguing with the archetypes, by living your unique variation on universal patterns, you become who you actually are rather than who you've been conditioned to be. But here's the paradox. Becoming individual requires acknowledging the collective. To be truly yourself, you must recognize what isn't uniquely yours: the inherited patterns, the archetypal structures, the collective dimensions of your psyche. The path to individuality leads through the collective unconscious. Myths guide this paradoxical journey. They show you universal patterns while calling you to your unique expression of them. The hero's journey is archetypal, everyone faces some version of it. But your hero's journey is yours alone. No one else can live it for you. No one else's specific challenges, specific monsters, specific treasures are identical to yours. This is why you need myths from multiple traditions, multiple cultures, multiple perspectives. Each tradition emphasizes different aspects of the archetypal patterns. Each cultural expression reveals something the others miss. Greek myths show you certain archetypal dynamics. Norse myths illuminate others. African, Asian, indigenous American myths each offers unique perspectives on universal patterns. When you feel connected to myths you've never heard before, you're experiencing your citizenship in the human community across time and space. You're recognizing that the deepest truths about existence aren't confined to one culture, one era, one tradition. They're inscribed in the structure of consciousness itself, waiting to be discovered again and again, in each generation, in each individual life. Understanding all this intellectually is one thing, living it is another. How do you actually work with this recognition? How do you engage with the myths that resonate with you in ways that facilitate real psychological transformation? The first step is recognizing when a myth has activated something in you. This isn't the same as simply enjoying a good story. You know its archetypal resonance when you feel physically affected chills, tears, a catch in your breath. Your body knows before your mind does. There's a numinous quality, a sense of encountering something sacred or profound. The story stays with you for days, weeks, years. It returns to you at unexpected moments. You find yourself thinking about it in relation to your own life, seeing parallels, asking, "What does this mean for me?" When this happens, don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. This is your psyche communicating with you through the language it knows best, image and symbol. The practice Jung developed for engaging with this material is called active imagination. It's not passive fantasy or daydreaming. It's a disciplined dialogue with the unconscious. Here's how it works in practice. Take the mythic image or figure that's affecting you. Close your eyes and let it come alive in your imagination. Don't control it or direct it. Let it act according to its own nature. Then engage with it, ask it questions, listen for responses, let a drama unfold. This isn't you making things up. It's you discovering what's already present in the unconscious. If the hero from the myth speaks to you, ask, "What journey are you calling me toward?" If the monster appears, ask, "What part of myself do you represent?" If the wise figure emerges, inquire, "What do you want me to understand?" This sounds simple, almost silly, but the insights that emerge from genuine active imagination can be startling. You'll hear responses you didn't consciously formulate. You'll understand connections you didn't rationally deduce. The unconscious will reveal itself through the images. Another practice: write the myth into your life. Look at your current situation, the challenge you're facing, the transition you're in, the conflict you're experiencing, and ask, "What myth does this resemble?" Not to reduce your life to a story, but to see the archetypal pattern beneath the personal details. Are you in the descent phase of a hero's journey? Are you being called to sacrifice something, like countless mythic figures had to? Are you in the dark night, the underworld period, where transformation happens in darkness? Is this a death and rebirth cycle? A confrontation with shadow, an initiation? Seeing the archetypal pattern doesn't solve the problem, but it changes your relationship to it. Your struggle becomes meaningful rather than merely painful. You understand that what you're experiencing has purpose, even if you can't see the outcome yet. This shows up in your life as a shift in perspective. Where you previously felt victimized by circumstances, you begin to see yourself as the hero of your own journey. Where you felt your darkness was proof of your brokenness, you recognize it as the shadow that must be integrated. Where you experienced meaningless suffering, you start to sense an archetypal initiation unfolding. One warning: don't use myths to bypass the actual work. It's tempting to identify with mythic heroes without doing the actual heroic work. To say, "I'm on a hero's journey," while avoiding the real challenges, to spiritualize your problems rather than facing them. The archetypes demand genuine engagement, not just intellectual understanding. You might notice resistance arising when a myth touches something real. Your rational mind will offer explanations, dismissals, skepticism. "It's just a story. This is projection. You're reading too much into it." These are defenses against the unconscious. The ego feels threatened when deeper layers of the psyche become conscious. Push through this resistance gently. You don't have to abandon rationality or critical thinking, but make space for the irrational, symbolic, archetypal dimensions of your experience. Both slash and rather than either slash or. The first step is recognizing that your life has mythic dimensions. That you're not just solving practical problems and managing responsibilities. You're also, whether you acknowledge it or not, engaged in archetypal processes. You're living patterns that humans have lived for millennia. When you begin to see this, your daily life becomes richer. That conflict with your boss isn't just workplace drama. It might be a power archetype demanding integration. That attraction to someone isn't just chemistry. It might be anima or animus projection calling you to work on your inner masculine or feminine. That impulse to quit your job and change everything isn't just dissatisfaction. It might be the self calling you toward individuation. This doesn't mean ignoring practical reality. You still need to handle your responsibilities, make wise decisions, consider consequences. But you're doing so with awareness of the deeper currents operating beneath surface events. Integration looks like living on multiple levels simultaneously. You're paying the bills asterisk and asterisk. You're on a hero's journey. You're having that difficult conversation asterisk and asterisk. You're wrestling with an archetype. You're making dinner asterisk and asterisk. You're participating in eternal patterns. This multilayered existence is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming whole rather than one-sided. Living from both ego and self, honoring both personal and collective dimensions, being fully yourself while recognizing yourself as expression of something universal. The myths you resonate with are guides for this process. They illuminate where you are, what's required of you, what transformation awaits. Not in literal terms. You're probably not actually going to slay a dragon or descend to an underworld. But psychologically, symbolically, archetypally, you are. What happens when you begin living this way? When you recognize the mythic dimensions of your existence and engage consciously with archetypal patterns, something shifts fundamentally. First, loneliness transforms into solitude. Before, when you struggled, you felt isolated, like you alone were facing this particular darkness, this specific challenge. Now you recognize that your struggle, while uniquely yours in its details, is archetypal in its essence. Countless others across time have faced this pattern. You're participating in the eternal human journey. This doesn't minimize your pain, but it contextualizes it. You're not cosmically alone. The myths are proof that others have walked this path. They've left maps, guidance, testimony. You're in dialogue with ancestors you'll never know, connected through the shared patterns of the collective unconscious. Second, your relationship with your own depths changes. The unconscious is no longer just the source of disturbing dreams and irrational impulses. It becomes a wellspring of wisdom, creativity, guidance. You learn to listen to it, trust it, dialogue with it. You discover that the psyche has its own intelligence, often wiser than the ego's plans. When a myth speaks to you now, you know how to respond. You can work with it through active imagination, through creative expression, through simply living its pattern consciously. The unconscious is no longer foreign territory. It's part of your landscape, integrated into your sense of self. Third, paradoxes that previously tormented you become generative tensions. You are individual asterisk and asterisk collective, unique asterisk and asterisk universal, free asterisk and asterisk patterned. The ego that insists on total autonomy relaxes. You recognize yourself as both agent and participant, creating your life while also discovering patterns that were there before you chose them. This brings a particular kind of freedom, not the freedom of unlimited choice, but the freedom of alignment, living according to your deeper nature rather than against it, following the path that's actually yours rather than the one you think you should want. Your creative life deepens. Artists have always known this intuitively, that they're not inventing from nothing but channeling something that comes through them. Now you recognize this dynamic in all aspects of life. You're not just executing plans formed by your conscious mind. You're collaborating with deeper forces, allowing archetypal patterns to express themselves through your unique life. Relationships transform as well. You begin to see others as fellow travelers on their own archetypal journeys. When someone triggers you intensely, you recognize it as projection, an archetypal pattern operating unconsciously. When you're drawn powerfully to someone, you understand it as archetypal activation, not just personal chemistry. This doesn't diminish love or connection. It deepens understanding. The transformation isn't completed. This is crucial to understand. Individuation isn't a destination you reach and then rest. It's an ongoing process, a lifetime's work. You don't become fully conscious, fully integrated, fully whole. You become more conscious, more integrated, moving toward wholeness. There will be setbacks, new challenges that activate unconscious patterns you thought you'd resolved. Crises that plunge you back into darkness. This is normal, expected, part of the process. The spiral path means revisiting similar territory at deeper levels. But something fundamental has changed. You know the landscape now. When you're in the underworld, you recognize it. You know it's not forever. You know what's required, not fighting it, not trying to escape prematurely, but doing the work the darkness demands. Facing what must be faced, retrieving what was lost, waiting for the transformation that can only happen in depths. You become, in Jung's phrase, more yourself. Not a better person according to external standards, but more authentic, more whole, more aligned with your deeper nature. The persona, the social mask, loosens its grip. You can still wear it when needed, but you're no longer imprisoned by it. This is what the myths have been trying to tell you all along, that transformation is possible, that the journey, while difficult, leads somewhere real, that becoming whole requires descending into brokenness, that death and rebirth aren't metaphors, they're psychological realities you must live through. So we return to where we began, but now you understand differently. That recognition you feel when encountering myths you've never heard before isn't mysterious anymore. It's not coincidence, it's not projection, it's contact with the collective unconscious, the inherited psychological structures you carry, the archetypal patterns that organize human experience. You are individual, yes, unique, irreplaceable, unlike anyone who has ever lived, but you're also collective. You participate in patterns older than history. You carry images and structures inherited from the depths of human time. You're connected to everyone who has ever lived through the shared substrate of the psyche. The myths are bridges between these dimensions of your being. They articulate in image and story what can't be captured in concepts. They show you patterns you're living before you consciously recognize them. They illuminate the path when your personal knowledge isn't enough. This is why you need them, not as entertainment or escapism, but as psychological and spiritual technology developed over millennia. They're humanity's accumulated wisdom about the deep processes of transformation, the archetypal patterns of existence, the journey of becoming whole. When a myth speaks to you, when you feel that shock of recognition, that sense of coming home, honor it. Work with it, let it teach you what it knows, not by believing it literally, but by living it symbolically. By recognizing the pattern it reveals and engaging with that pattern consciously in your life. You're never alone in your struggles. The myths prove this. They're testimony that humans have always faced these challenges, these transformations, these descents and resurrections. The specific details change, but the archetypal patterns remain, and in the end, your life becomes its own myth. Not because you're special or chosen, but because every human life, lived consciously, is a unique expression of eternal patterns. Your particular variation on the hero's journey has never been lived before and will never be lived again, yet it echoes every hero's journey that came before. The myths you've never heard before already live in you. In encountering them, you're not learning, you're remembering, not discovering something foreign, but recognizing what was always yours. This is the invitation to live mythically, to recognize the depths, to become who you actually are. The journey continues.